In a world where women were expected to wilt like desert flowers, Sylvie Navarro bloomed like wildfire, and that terrified everyone who knew her. The morning sun painted the Colorado Territory in shades of amber and rust when Sylvie Navarro stepped out of the Trenton Ranch house for what she knew would be the last time. Her leather boots, worn smooth from years of hard work, struck the wooden porch with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through branding seasons, harsh winters, and heartbreak that would have felled lesser souls. The ranch spread before her like a testament to her own hands. Neat fencing she'd helped string, water troughs she'd positioned for maximum efficiency, and grazing land that now supported twice the cattle it once did. Every improvement bore her fingerprints. Every success carried her sweat. Yet here she stood, cast out like yesterday's bathwater. "You sure about this, Miss Sylvie?" Old Malachi Shaw's weathered voice drifted from the corral where he was breaking. In a stubborn Mustang. The horse bucked and snorted, but Malachi held firm, just like he'd watched Sylvie do with everything life threw at her. Steam rose from the animal's flanks in the cool morning air, and dust swirled around its hooves like tiny tornadoes. She adjusted the weight of her traveling bag, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulder from yesterday's confrontation with Royce. Trenton. The bruise would fade, but his words still burned. "No man wants a wife who can outshoot him, outsmart him, and outwork him, Sylvie. You're too much woman for this territory. Too much woman." The phrase tasted bitter as alkali dust. Behind her, the ranch house stood silent as a tomb. Thea Harmon, the cook, had already said her tearful goodbyes at dawn, pressing a bundle of biscuits into Sylvie's hands along with a promise to pray for her safe journey. The bunkhouse remained shuttered. The hands knew better than to show their faces during Royce's purge of everything that reminded him of his failures. "I'm sure as sunrise, Malachi." She turned toward the road that would take her to Copper Creek, where the morning stagecoach waited. Some folks collect broken things to fix them. Others just throw him away when they get too strong to handle. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 3 years, she'd poured her heart into making the Trenton Ranch profitable, turning barren grazing land into something that could feed a growing herd. She'd negotiated water rights with neighboring spreads when disputes threatened to turn bloody, organized the hands during Royce's frequent gambling trips to Denver, and kept the books balanced when his debts threatened to swallow them whole, but she'd also kept his secrets. The late-night visitors who spoke in hushed tones about cattle that had wandered off other people's ranges. The mysterious increase in their herd that coincided with reports of missing stock from neighboring spreads. The way Royce's eyes went. Flat and dangerous when anyone asked too many questions. But when Sheriff Phoenix Chandler started sniffing around about those missing cattle from the Morrison spread, Royce had made his choice. Better to sacrifice the woman who knew too much than risk his own neck in a noose. "You always were too good for that yellow-bellied snake," Malachi called out, tipping his hat. The Mustang had calmed under his steady hands, now standing quietly despite the occasional ear flick of defiance. "Territory's full of better men, if you know where to look." Sylvie almost smiled. If only it were that simple. But she'd learned the hard way that strength in a woman was like fire. Useful when contained, dangerous when it burned too bright. Men wanted warmth from their women, not the kind of blazing independence that could consume everything in its path. The walk to Copper Creek took her through country she knew like the lines on her own palms. Scrub oak dotted the hillsides, their leaves already turning gold with the approach of autumn. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. This land had taught her that survival meant adapting, bending when necessary, but never breaking. The stagecoach station buzzed with morning travelers, miners heading to Silver Peak with picks slung over their shoulders and hope burning in their eyes. A family bound for Denver with 3 wide-eyed children clutching cornhusk dolls, and a handful of cowpokes looking for work, their gear worn but well-maintained. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted from the station house, mixing with dust and horse sweat to create the distinctive perfume of frontier life. Sylvie bought her ticket to Riverton, a growing cattle town where nobody knew her reputation, and she could start fresh, maybe as a schoolteacher or seamstress, something proper and quiet. The station agent, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, barely glanced at her as he counted out her change. "All aboard for Riverton." The driver's voice cut through the morning air like a church bell. We'll be making one stop at Devil's Canyon for water and provisions. Devil's Canyon. Sylvie had heard stories about that stretch of country, beautiful, but treacherous, where flash floods could turn a peaceful creek into a raging torrent in minutes, and where more than one traveler had simply vanished into the red rock maze. Apache had once used those canyons as strongholds, and some said their spirits still guarded the ancient paths. She climbed into the coach, settling beside a nervous-looking woman clutching a carpet bag like a lifeline and across from a well-dressed man who kept checking his pocket watch with the precision of someone accustomed to schedules. The coach smelled of leather and dust, with an underlying hint of the previous passenger's cologne. The woman, Mrs. Harmon, she introduced herself with a trembling voice, was heading to Riverton to care for her sister's children after a fever. Took their mother. Her eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much death. The man, Zuri Vaughn, dealt in mining equipment and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether he was too much of anything. As the stagecoach lurched into motion with a creak of leather and wood, Sylvie pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar landscape roll past. Cottonwoods lined the creek beds like green ribbons against the brown earth, and red-winged blackbirds called from the cattails. She'd missed this country's stark beauty, even if its people had no place for someone like her. But would her reputation for being too strong follow her to this godforsaken canyon? Or was something far more dangerous waiting ahead? You running from something, miss? Mrs. Harmon's soft voice held genuine concern as the stagecoach swayed through a particularly rough stretch of road. Forgive me for asking, but you got the look of someone carrying a heavy load. Sylvie considered her answer carefully, watching the landscape grow wilder through the dust-streaked window. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is know when to walk away. The older woman nodded knowingly, her weathered hands smoothing the fabric of her black morning dress. My Herald used to say that courage ain't about staying when it's easy. It's about knowing when to start over when staying would kill something important inside you. Zuri Vaughn looked up from his pocket watch with the expression of a man unaccustomed to philosophical discussions in stagecoaches. Seems to me a person ought to fight for what's theirs instead of running off at the first sign of trouble. The words hit Sylvie like a physical blow. She'd heard that sentiment before, usually from men who'd never had to choose between their principles and their survival. And what would you suggest I fight with, Mr. Vaughn? Pretty words and good intentions. Well, because I tried that for 3 years, she continued, her voice gaining the sharp edge that had made Royce nervous. I fought rustlers, drought, and creditors. I fought ignorance and superstition and men who thought a woman's place was anywhere but making decisions that mattered. Mrs. Harmon reached over and patted Sylvie's gloved hand. Some battles ain't meant to be won, child. They're meant to teach us when to choose a different war. As they climbed higher into the canyon country, the air grew thinner and the silence deeper. This was empty land, where a person could hear their own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through stone carved into impossible shapes by centuries of flash floods and desert storms. Red rock walls rose on either side of the narrow road like the ribs of some ancient beast, and shadows pooled in crevices where the sun couldn't reach. It was also dangerous land, where the unwary could find themselves prey to both nature's fury and man's greed. Apache warriors had once used these very canyons as strongholds, appearing like ghosts to strike at wagon trains before melting back into the maze of stone. More recently, road agents had taken up the tradition, though with less honor and twice the cruelty. The stagecoach rounded a bend, wheels clattering over loose stones, and Sylvie caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Fresh wagon tracks led off the main road toward a narrow canyon, deep ruts that spoke of heavy loads and multiple trips. The tracks matched the description Sheriff Phoenix Chandler had given of the missing Morrison cattle drive: wide wheels, with a distinctive chip in the left rear that left a jagged mark in the dirt. She was about to mention it to Vaughn when movement in the rocks above caught her eye. Sunlight glinted off something metallic, too bright and too brief to be natural. Her hand moved instinctively toward her traveling bag and the Colt .45 hidden beneath her spare dress. The crack of rifle fire split the morning silence like the voice of God's own judgment. The coach lurched violently as the horses screamed and reared, iron shoes striking sparks from stone. Mrs. Harmon tumbled against Sylvie. With a cry of terror, her carpet bag spilling open to reveal carefully folded children's clothes and a small wooden cross. "Road agents!" the driver shouted from above, his voice tight with fear and fury. "Everyone down." Through the window, Sylvie saw masked riders emerge from the rocks like deadly shadows, their horses sure-footed on terrain that would challenge. A mountain goat. 5 men, maybe 6, too many for the driver and guard to handle alone. Their leader sat a magnificent black stallion with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. "Come out peaceful like," the leader called, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "We ain't looking to hurt nobody who don't give us cause." But Sylvie Navarro had spent too many years on the frontier to believe pretty lies from masked men. She'd seen what road agents left behind. Bodies stripped naked and left for the buzzards, women violated and murdered, children orphaned or worse. These men hadn't ridden down from the rocks to exchange pleasantries. "What do we do?" Vaughn whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air, and his hands shook as he clutched his sample case. "You do nothing," Sylvie said quietly, reaching into her bag. Her fingers found the familiar grip of her father's Colt, the weapon he'd taught her to use when she was barely tall enough to hold it steady. "Mrs. Harmon, can you keep low and quiet?" The older woman nodded, her lips moving in what might have been prayer. "You there in the coach?" The leader's voice carried a note of impatience now. "Time's wasting, and my boys are getting nervous." Nervous men make mistakes, and mistakes get people killed. Above them, she could hear the driver arguing in harsh whispers with his guard, probably debating whether to fight or surrender. The guard would be young, she figured, maybe on his first run through dangerous country. The driver would know better than to trust road agents' promises. The stagecoach rocked as someone climbed down from the driver's seat. Boots crunched on gravel, moving toward the passenger door with deliberate slowness. "Easy now," came a different voice, younger, with a slight tremor that suggested this might be his first hold-up. "Just want to have a friendly chat about what you folks might be carrying." Sylvie made her decision. The Colt slid free of her bag with barely a whisper of sound, its weight solid and reassuring in her palm. She'd been called too strong, too dangerous, too much woman for polite society. Perhaps it was time to prove them right. The door handle turned with a metallic click. "Mrs. Harmon whimpered softly, clutching her wooden cross. Vaughn had gone pale as fresh snow, his breath coming in short gasps that fogged the cool air, but Sylvie Navarro sat perfectly still, finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the door to swing open. She'd survived 3 years with a man who'd traded in stolen cattle and broken promises. She'd learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders and violence in the way he held his hands. Would her hard-won skills be enough to save them all, or had she finally found something stronger than her own stubborn will to survive? The stagecoach door swung open with a rusty groan, and sunlight flooded the dim interior like the mouth of hell itself. A young man with nervous eyes peered in, his bandana pulled up to hide everything below his nose. The barrel of his rifle gleamed dully in the morning light. Well, he drawled, trying for menace, but achieving something closer to boyish uncertainty. "What have we got here?" "A preacher's wife, a drummer," and his words died as he met Sylvie's steady gaze. Something in her expression made him step back half a pace, though he probably couldn't have said why. "Out," he managed, gesturing with the rifle. "All of you." "Nice and slow." Mrs. Harmon sobbed quietly, clutching her cross so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Vaughn's breathing had become rapid and shallow, the kind that preceded either fainting or blind panic. Neither would serve them well in the next few minutes. "It's going to be all right," Sylvie murmured, just loud enough for her companions to hear. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to crisis. "Do exactly what they say, and stay behind me." She stepped out first, her Colt hidden in the folds of her traveling dress. The canyon walls rose around them like the sides of a vast cathedral, red stone carved by wind and water into impossible spires and arches. Beautiful country for dying in, if it came to that. The leader sat his black stallion 20 feet away, close enough to command, but far enough to retreat if things went sideways. He was older than his nervous companion, maybe 35, with the kind of lean build that came from hard living. His eyes above the bandana were the color of winter sky, cold and calculating. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man holding all the good cards. "Fancy meeting decent folks in such a lonesome place." 3 other riders had positioned themselves strategically around the stagecoach. The driver and guard sat motionless on their bench, hands raised and faces grim. One of the outlaws held the horses' bridles, speaking to them in low, soothing tones, the mark of a man who understood that spooked animals could ruin even the best-laid plans. "I'm Gideon Rowe," the leader continued, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Maybe you've heard the name." Sylvie had indeed heard the name. Gideon Rowe's gang had been terrorizing the territory for 2 years, hitting stages, robbing banks, and rustling cattle with an efficiency that spoke of inside information. Sheriff Chandler had been hunting them without success, always arriving a day late and $1 short. "Can't say that I have," she lied smoothly to Rowe's eyes crinkled at the corners, amusement or suspicion, impossible to tell which. "Well now, that's refreshing. Most folks know my reputation by now." Mrs. Harmon whimpered as she climbed down from the coach, her legs barely supporting her weight. Vaughn followed, his sample case clutched against his chest like armor. The young outlaw kept his rifle trained on them while his eyes darted nervously between the canyon walls, as if expecting cavalry to come thundering down at any moment. "Here's how this works," Rowe announced, settling back in his saddle. "You folks contribute to our traveling fund, and we part ways as friends. Anybody gets heroic ideas, well." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but his meaning was clear enough. One of the other outlaws, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes, spurred his horse closer to Mrs. Harmon. "What you got in that bag, Grandma? Family silver? Wedding ring, maybe?" "Please," Mrs. Harmon whispered. "It's just clothes for my sister's children. They ain't got much since their mama passed." The cruel-eyed man laughed. "Ain't that touching, boys? Family charity." He reached down and snatched the carpet bag from her trembling hands, dumping its contents onto the rocky ground. Small dresses and boys' shirts scattered in the dust, along with the wooden cross and what looked like a daguerreotype in a tin frame. "Nothing but rags," he said with disgust, but his boot ground the photograph into the dirt anyway. That casual cruelty ignited something in Sylvie's chest, a familiar fire that had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count. The same fire that had made her stand up to rustlers twice her size, that had driven her to work 18-hour days to save a ranch that wasn't even hers, that had ultimately cost her everything she thought she wanted. "You," Rose said, pointing at Vaughn. "Drummer man, let's see what you're peddling." Vaughn's hands shook as he opened his sample case, revealing gleaming mining equipment, drill bits, measuring tools, and what looked like small explosive charges for blasting rock. The outlaws gathered around with interest. "Well now," Rowe mused, "might have use for some of this." But it was when his attention turned to Sylvie that the real danger began. "And you, pretty lady, what's a woman like you doing on a stage to nowhere?" "Starting over," she said simply. "Running from something, aren't we all?" Rowe studied her for a long moment, and Sylvie could feel him taking her measure the way a horseman evaluated a new mount, looking for strengths, weaknesses, breaking points. She'd been evaluated by dangerous men before, and she recognized the cold assessment in his winter blue eyes. "You got spine," he said finally. "I respect that. But spine don't stop bullets, and my boys here get antsy when folks don't show proper respect." As if summoned by his words, the cruel-eyed outlaw moved his horse closer to Sylvie, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the yellow stumps of his teeth. "Maybe we should search her real thorough like, boss. Make sure she ain't hiding nothing valuable." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mrs. Harmon made a small, desperate sound. The young outlaw looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. Even Rowe's expression tightened slightly. Perhaps he drew the line at some things, or perhaps he simply preferred his victims compliant rather than desperate. But Sylvie Navarro had drawn her own lines long ago, carved them deep in the bedrock of her soul, with lessons learned from hard men and harder choices. She thought of Royce Trenton's casual dismissal, of all the times she'd been told she was too much, too strong, too dangerous for a world that preferred its women quiet and grateful. "That," she said quietly, her hand finding the grip of her hidden Colt. would be a mistake. But was she fast enough to outdraw 5 armed men? Or had her reputation for being too strong finally written a check her gun couldn't cash? The silence that followed Sylvie's words stretched thin as wire, vibrating with the tension of 6 shooters and shortened breath. The cruel-eyed outlaw's grin widened, revealing more gaps where teeth should have been. Listen to this wildcat. Boss, he wheezed. Thinks she can scare us with sass and vinegar. But Gideon Rowe wasn't looking at his man anymore. His winter blue eyes had locked onto Sylvie's face with the intensity of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. Something in her bearing, in the way she held herself despite being surrounded and outgunned, had captured his full attention. What's your name? He asked quietly. Sylvie Navarro. The name hit the canyon air like a stone dropped into still water. The young outlaw's rifle wavered slightly. Even the cruel-eyed man's grin faltered for just a moment. Navarro, Rowe repeated thoughtfully. You wouldn't be the Navarro who ran the Trenton spread? The one who could outshoot half the men in 3 counties. Sylvie said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. Well, I'll be damned. Rowe leaned forward in his saddle, genuinely interested. Now, stories say you once faced down 5 rustlers single-handed. Put 3 of them in the ground before they knew what hit them. Stories tend to grow in the telling, Sylvie replied, though her fingers tightened imperceptibly on her concealed weapon. Maybe, but here's what I know for certain. Sheriff Chandler's been asking questions about you. Seems he thinks you might know something about certain missing cattle. Cattle that might have wandered onto the Trenton spread through mysterious circumstances. The cruel-eyed outlaw spat into the dust. So what if she does? She's just one woman. Jake, Rose said without taking his eyes off Sylvie. Shut your mouth before I shut it permanent. But Jake was already spurring his horse closer, emboldened by whiskey and the promise of easy prey. I say we take what we want and have some fun with. The crack of Sylvie's Colt shattered the canyon silence like thunder from a clear sky. Jake's hat spun off his head, a neat hole punched through the crown. His horse reared, dumping him unceremoniously. Into the dust, Sylvie held the smoking gun steady, covering the group with movements fluid as water. Next one won't be a warning shot. Jesus Christ, the young outlaw yelped, his rifle swinging wildly between targets. Easy, Billy, Rowe commanded, his voice sharp as broken glass. To his credit, he hadn't reached for his own weapon, though his hand rested casually near his holster. Miss Navarro's made her point. Jake scrambled to his feet, face flushed with rage and humiliation. You crazy bitch. You'll what? Sylvie's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to backing down dangerous men. Because from where I stand, you're the one eating dirt. Mrs. Harmon had pressed herself against the stagecoach wheel, eyes wide with terror and something that might have been admiration. Vaughn clutched his sample case like a shield, his face pale as fresh cotton. Now that's impressive, Rose said, and he sounded genuinely pleased. Fast draw, clean shot, nerves steady as bedrock. I can see why the stories follow you around. Stories and trouble seem to go hand in hand, Sylvie replied, keeping her weapon trained on the group. Trouble. Rowe laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Lady, you're talking to trouble personified. But I got a proposition for you. I'm listening. You know this country. You know where Chandler's likely to be patrolling, what routes he takes, when he changes his patterns. Information like that's worth more than whatever trinkets these folks might be carrying. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sylvie could feel Mrs. Harmon's eyes on her, silently pleading. Vaughn had gone even paler. If such a thing were possible, and if I don't feel like sharing, then we take what we can and ride on, Rose said with a shrug. But that seems wasteful, don't you think? Woman with your skills, stuck on a stage to nowhere because some weak-spined rancher couldn't handle what he had. The words cut deeper than Sylvie cared to admit. Rowe had done his research, or at least heard enough gossip to piece together her recent troubles. The truth of his assessment made it sting all the more. You seem to know a lot about my business. Territory's small, Miss Navarro. Word travels fast when someone like you gets thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. His voice carried what might have been sympathy, though with a man like Rowe, it was impossible to tell if it was genuine or calculated. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing off canyon walls in a way that made it sound like the earth itself was groaning. Dark clouds had gathered above the rim, promising one of those sudden desert storms that could turn a peaceful creek into a raging torrent in minutes. Storm's coming, Billy observed nervously, glancing at the sky. Always is in country like this. Roe agreed. Question is whether folks are smart enough to get out of its way. He was still talking to Billy, but his eyes remained fixed on Sylvie. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone present. Jake had retrieved his hat and was examining the bullet hole with a mixture of fury and grudging respect. Boss, we can't let her what? Roe's voice carried a note of warning. Demonstrate that she's exactly as dangerous as advertised? I'd say that's valuable information. The first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the dusty ground with sounds like tiny explosions. Within minutes, the intermittent drops would become a deluge, turning the narrow canyon into a deadly funnel for flash floods. Time's wasting. One of the other outlaws called out, his horse dancing nervously. We need to clear out before this place turns into a river. Sylvie could feel the weight of decision pressing down on her like the gathering storm. Join with outlaws and use her skills for robbery and murder, or trust in the same strength that had gotten her cast out from everything she'd worked to build. But then she looked at Mrs. Harmon's tear-streaked face, at the children's clothes scattered in the dust, at Vaughn clutching his simple samples like they represented his whole future. Would her choice save innocent lives, or had she finally found herself caught between storms too powerful for even her legendary strength to weather? The first real drops of rain struck Sylvie's face like cold bullets, each one a reminder that time was running out. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them as thunder rolled overhead, promising the kind of flash flood that could sweep away horses, men, and stagecoaches without a trace. Well, Miss Navarro? Gideon Rowe's voice carried a note of urgency now, though he tried to hide it behind casual confidence. Storm's coming fast, and we all need to make our choices. Sylvie looked again at Mrs. Harmon, at the children's clothes, scattered in the dust already turning to mud, at Vaughn's terrified face. These weren't cattle thieves or corrupt ranchers. They were just ordinary people trying to get from one day to the next. The same kind of people she'd spent 3 years protecting on the Trenton spread. The same kind who'd been caught in the crossfire of other people's greed and violence. I've made my choice, she said quietly. Before anyone could react, she pivoted and put 2 bullets into the front wheels of Jake's horse, sending the animal bucking and screaming away from the group. In the same fluid motion, she dove behind the stagecoach as return fire exploded from the outlaws' guns. Get down, she shouted to Mrs. Harmon and Vaughn. Under the coach, bullets splintered wood and rang off metal as the outlaws spread out, their horses fighting the growing wind and rain. The stagecoach horses reared in their traces, adding to the chaos with their terrified whinnying. You stupid bitch. Jake screamed from behind a boulder, blood streaming from where his horse had thrown him against the rocks. You just signed all your death warrants. But Sylvie Navarro had been in firefights before. She knew that panicked shooting in bad weather killed more rocks than people, and that men who relied on intimidation often folded when faced with real resistance. Billy, she called out to the young outlaw. You don't have to die for this. Walk away now. Can't do that, ma'am, came the shaky reply from behind an outcropping. Boss would kill me sure. Boss might not live long enough to worry about it. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the canyon like day, followed immediately by thunder that shook dust from the rock walls. The storm was directly overhead now, and the intermittent raindrops were becoming a steady downpour. Rose's voice cut through the noise of wind and gunfire. Miss Navarro, last chance to be reasonable. I'm being plenty reasonable, she shouted. Back, reloading with practiced efficiency. Reasonable enough to know the difference between right and wrong. She heard the distinctive sound of spurs on stone and knew one of them was trying to flank her position. The stagecoach provided good cover from the front, but it wouldn't protect her from multiple angles. She needed to even the odds before they surrounded her. A shadow moved between the rocks to her left. Jake, limping but determined, his gun gleaming wetly in the rain. Sylvie waited until he stepped into the open, then put a bullet through his shoulder that spun him around and sent his weapon flying into the mud. One down, she muttered. But her shot had revealed her position, and return fire immediately peppered the ground around her. She rolled behind the coach's rear wheel as bullets chewed up the earth where she'd been lying. You can't get us all. Ro called out, his voice closer now. And that flood's coming whether you like it or not. He was right about the flood. Sylvie could hear it now, a distant rumble that had nothing to do with thunder. Somewhere up in the high country, the storm was already dumping tons of water into narrow channels that would funnel it all down into this very canyon. Mrs. Harmon sobbed quietly from beneath the coach, clutching her wooden cross. Vaughn had gone, silent, either unconscious or too terrified to make a sound. Driver, Sylvie shouted up to the stagecoach bench. You alive up there? Still breathing, came the reply. But Tom's hit bad. The guard. If he was wounded, that left only the driver. And herself against however many outlaws remained. Not good odds, especially with a flash flood bearing down on them. Lightning split the sky again, and in its brief illumination, Sylvie saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. A lone rider was picking his way down the treacherous canyon path, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew this country like his own heartbeat. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. Even through the driving rain, she could see the silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Phoenix Chandler had finally arrived. Row. Chandler's voice boomed off the canyon walls like the voice of judgment itself. It's over. You're surrounded. It was a bluff. Chandler was alone, but it worked. Billy broke cover, running for his horse with panic overriding whatever loyalty he might have felt. One of the other outlaws followed, spurring his mount toward the narrow trail that led out of the canyon. But Gideon Rowe was made of sterner stuff. He stepped into the open, his gun trained on Sylvie, his face grim with the knowledge that his luck had finally run out. Maybe, he called back to Chandler, but I'm taking the Wildcat with me. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, but it wasn't Rowe's gun that fired. Sylvie's Colt bucked in her hand, and the outlaw leader staggered backward, his weapon dropping to the muddy ground. Too much woman, she said quietly, watching him fall. That's what they all said. Too much woman for this territory. But as Sheriff Chandler reached them and the distant rumble of floodwater grew closer, as Mrs. Harmon emerged from beneath the coach with tears of gratitude streaming down her face, as Vaughn shakily began gathering his scattered samples, Sylvie realized something important. Maybe she hadn't been too much woman after all. Maybe this territory had simply been too small for someone who refused to make herself smaller. The flood came 20 minutes later, roaring down the canyon like a liquid avalanche. But they were already climbing to safety on the high trail. Behind them, Devil's Canyon filled with churning brown water that swept away all traces of the morning's violence. As they crested the canyon rim, Sheriff Chandler turned to her with something that might have been admiration. Territory could use more folks like you, Miss Navarro. Folks who know the difference between strength and cruelty. Sylvie looked back at the wild country spread below them, at the storm clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of blue sky. Perhaps it was time to stop running from who she was and start looking for a place that could appreciate what she had to offer. Well, Sheriff, she said with the first genuine smile she'd felt in months. Maybe it's time this territory learned to handle a little more woman than it's used to. If this tale of courage in the face of adversity stirred something in your heart, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more stories from the untamed frontier. And tell us in the comments below, where are you watching from today?